All right, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Alina Kisnelska, and I just wanted to introduce your moderator for the panel. Aditi Joshi, she, they, is a South Asian femme, daughter of immigrants. She currently serves as the research manager for the Health and Human Rights Program, FAM Evaluation, where she takes her experience with qualitative research and participatory design to bring youth and caregiver voice to evaluating San Francisco's pilot foster care program for youth who have experienced or are at risk of commercial sexual exploitation. Aditi has worked directly with government, advocates, and clients to ensure policy and services work for those intentionally excluded. Before joining HRC, Aditi worked as a design researcher at the nonprofit Code for America, where she researched, visualized, and developed policy to implement automatic record clearance across the country. This about folks living with convictions to access jobs, housing, and other opportunities that they couldn't because of the barriers associated with their background check. She has also been embedded within the city government at the Philadelphia Service Design Studio, where she worked with the unhoused population to redesign Philadelphia's Office of Homelessness Prevention, Diversion, and Intake Program. Aditi has a passion for working within her community to craft healing-centered and trauma-informed relationships and experiences. She is also a community organizer with Defund SFPD Now, working to abolish the prison industrial complex and craft a world based in care instead of revenge. Aditi holds a master's degree in design, innovation, and citizenship from the Glasgow School of Art and a bachelor's in engineering design from Olin College of Engineering. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Aditi Joshi.
All right, everybody, good morning. Thank you all for being here. This is a fireside chat talking about criminal legal system data and its uses for policy. And today I'm going to be talking to Alec Karakatsanis. Alec is the founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Corps. Before launching and founding the Civil Rights Corps, Alec was a civil rights lawyer and public defender with the Special Litigations Division of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, which is a federal public defender in Alabama. Oh no, you were also a federal public defender in Alabama representing impoverished people accused of federal crimes, and the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Equal Justice Under Law. Alec was awarded the 2016 Trial Lawyer of the Year by Public Justice for his role in designing and bringing constitutional civil rights cases to challenge various aspects of the punishment bureaucracy across the United States, and the 2016 Stephen B. Bright Award for contributions to indigent defense in the South by Gideon's Promise. Alec's work at Civil Rights Corps challenging the money bail system in California was honored with the 2018 Champion of Public Defense Award by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Alec graduated from Yale College in 2005 with a degree in ethics, politics, and economics, and Harvard Law School in 2008. Alec is interested in ending human caging, surveillance, police, and the death penalty, immigration laws, war, and inequality. Most recently, he is the author of the book, Usual Cruelty. So everyone, if you could please join me in welcoming Alec. Great. So I'd like to maybe ground us just by starting to talk a little bit of the definition of so-called crime. We oftentimes, think of quote unquote crime as a fixed category, but I think we see more often than not that it's really changing and defined by those who have the power to craft the penal codes or craft legislation. So I was wondering if you could start just by talking a little bit about who gets to define what is and isn't considered so-called crime, and how these sort of like legal and social definitions of crime have been created.
Yeah, this is an essential question, I think, for understanding all of the discourse and rhetoric about public safety and crime. And so I'm really happy to talk about it and really happy to be here. So I think this question really operates at two levels. There's the first highest level of generality, which is how does something become illegal in our society? And like all of our other laws, decisions about what is illegal and what is legal are made by people who have power. which in a society like ours means people who are wealthy. In particular means typically, disproportionately, white people who are wealthy. So these kinds of decisions cover every facet of our society. So for example, at one point in US history, it was not illegal to possess the marijuana plant. There was a decision that was made by people for very particular reasons that actually had to do with wanting to give the police more discretion and power to punish and control Mexican-American immigrants. But they decided to make possession of the marijuana plant illegal. So in the last 30 years, 20 million people, human beings, have been taken from their schools and jobs and families and churches and loved ones and put into government-run cages of concrete and metal because they possess the marijuana plant, because a decision was made that the possession of this plant should be illegal. The same happened with cocaine. There were different reasons. People in power wanted to give the police discretion and authority to cage and surveil Black people, predominantly in the South. That's how the process began for cocaine becoming illegal. And it exists well beyond the field of drugs. So for example, it's illegal in our society for poor people on the street to wager over dice, constantly being surveilled and harassed and arrested and have their cash taken by police. It is not illegal to gamble in a casino or to wager over international currencies or the global price of wheat. These are the same kind of fundamental concept, but decisions have been made by people in power about which of them is going to be criminalized. The same is true at various stages in our country's history. It can be criminal to get an abortion, or it can be perfectly legal. It can be criminal to join a union. It can be criminalized to stop someone from joining a union. These are all just political choices across the wide range of areas across our society. They tend, so for example, we could live in a society where if you own a house with 4 extra bedrooms, it is a crime not to allow someone who doesn't have a place to live to sleep in your bedroom, one of your extra bedrooms. Or we could live in the society that we live in, where if you own a house with 4 extra bedrooms, you can call upon the force and violence of the state to come and arrest someone who doesn't have an extra bedroom, who wants to stay in your bedroom, who has no place else to go. These are just choices about what is a crime and what isn't. The second level of generality is among the things that we call crimes, which, as I just mentioned, are a very narrow subset of all the things that could possibly harm us, right? So like certain types of air pollution that are killing 7 million people around the world are not criminalized in this country, right? We made that decision at a high level. But among the things that are criminalized, like some types of air and water pollution are crimes. So it is a crime for companies to dump certain types of chemicals in our waterways. The second way in which crime is sort of socially constructed is which crimes do we even bother investigating and enforcing? You've heard police call themselves law enforcement. They want us to think of them as some kind of objective, neutral body that is making, a law is broken, it must be enforced. But in reality, police are only enforcing some laws against some people sometimes in some places. They're not enforcing water pollution regulations. Very few people are ever prosecuted for that. They're not enforcing air pollution regulations, right? And even among the things that they do enforce, like drug use, drug laws, like assault laws, they're not enforcing those laws in wealthy private boarding schools or on the Berkeley campus. They're enforcing those laws in communities of color. They're making very particular choices about where they're going to even look for crimes. Are we going to prosecute the person who takes deodorant from Walgreens? Or are we going to prosecute the corporation that steals money from the paycheck of a Walgreens worker? And what we know is that wage theft is a problem about 5 times that of all other property crime combined. And it's almost never investigated and prosecuted. And petty theft is almost always prosecuted if the authorities find out about it. So anyway, I think like it's really important to understand like what we even, when we talk about crime, we need to understand that it's a very politicized concept.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also what you were saying in terms of enforcement of those then codified penal codes, or what is, created as so-called crimes in our legislation, also then has a rippling impact on communities. And so I guess I'm curious sort of like how you think those creations of the legal and social definitions of what is considered crime then relates to what communities are policed and how they relate to over-incarceration, especially of Black and Brown communities.
Absolutely. So, you know, at the highest level, the people that are deciding what a crime is are interested in defining things as crime that allow them to more efficiently control segments of the population that from whom they want to extract wealth or labor or whatever else have you, right? It's a part of the decision-making process. Not only is it a total indifference to and lack of care about people's lives and their communities. So there's definitely a devaluation of the suffering and trauma and death that occur in communities of color. I mean, the people who control our society do not care about that in any meaningful way. But it's also like designed to give them maximum control and authority over people's lives. So that's why you see many of these crimes are incredibly discretionary. So things like disorderly conduct, one of the major arrests in this country, is really defined as whatever the police officer on the ground says it is. And decisions like trespassing or crimes like trespassing are also incredibly vague, right? It's technically a trespass offense to be on someone's property when they don't want you there. And because so much of our country's property has been privatized and enclosed and is now being hoarded by people who are ever increasingly wealthy and corporations and individual people, we have basically criminalized the very act of moving through space. And as we've seen, many cities across the country are increasingly passing various ordinances that prevent even people from existing on public space. And these decisions aren't being made because there's been some kind of scientific, rational calculus of like what would make all of us have more flourishing lives and what is better for overall public health and safety. These decisions are being made based on how can we preserve existing levels of property distribution and wealth and inequality without so how do we like basically manage the poorest and most vulnerable people in our society in a way that doesn't require us to actually change the distribution of property and wealth. I think that's how these decisions are mostly being made in terms of like what neighborhoods to deploy police. There's an amazing report that I recommend to all of you to read just to see how this all works by the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which is one of my favorite community organizations around the country. Incredibly intellectually rigorous work they're doing in their organizing community. It's a community based out of Skid Row in Los Angeles. And they have a report called Automating Banishment, which describes in incredible detail the process of how this works in Los Angeles and the complicity of universities like UCLA and large corporations and like Palantir and a number of other smaller for-profit businesses that various professors in the sciences have created to help police manage their data systems and help police do something called predictive policing. And then how all of those interests work with local real estate developers. It's a fascinating report. And I think better than I can describe, at a high level of generality, just look at how it's played out in Los Angeles. And I think it's a really for me, it was a deeply eye-opening report.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think what you're saying also about control of certain populations and certain types of people is really important for us to recognize, and also how policing and the ways in which, quote unquote, crime is constructed also serves as like a project of eugenics and a project of invisibilization. Like oftentimes we see, unhoused people being swept and criminalized as opposed to, getting housing, because, when there was the Super Bowl in San Francisco, there was an increase in sweeps because they didn't want tourists coming in to, see the housing crisis in San Francisco. So I think how that is then enforced in terms of, like hiding city problems is also, I think, goes according to what you were just saying as well. So I think that's really powerful. I want to also, I guess, shift gears a little bit to talk about how data is collected under this system as well. And so I'm curious sort of like, I think oftentimes when it comes to science and data, we think about it as categorically true. We think about science as sort of like a fixed thing that exists as truth. And so I'm curious sort of like how that is or isn't the case with quote unquote crime data, and how crime data is collected and how that changes sort of like the truthfulness of it.
Yeah, I think all of us read in the newspaper or see on television every day, like crime data, statistics. Robberies are up 14% over last month, or shootings are up 32%, or in many reports, crime is up. This is kind of a laughable concept, right? Because what does it even mean to say crime is up? So tax evasion is a crime. It's the most significant crime in terms of monetary value of any crime in our penal code. Tax evasion costs $1 trillion a year. To put that in perspective, it's about 100 times more than all robbery, burglary, theft combined. You don't see on the news a story about tax evasion every 5 minutes or every 14 seconds, right? And so when someone says crime is up, what you have to understand is they're not talking about air pollution violations or water pollution violations or tax evasion. They're actually not even talking about things like child sexual assault or rape. And the reason for that is our punishment bureaucrats are only collecting data about a very narrow subset of crimes that they call index crimes. And these index crimes are just a few categories of crimes, murder, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, and then some property crimes, larceny, motor vehicle theft, et cetera. There's a few, right? There's 13 or 14 of them. And they attempt to have us conflate something called public safety, which is a very important concept. We all want to be safe. We want to have the ability to live flourishing lives with our family and to do so in peace and safety and health. But the police have a goal of narrowing our conception of what it means to be safe that we don't even include in that. Am I safe from eviction? Are my children safe from drinking lead in their water? So when we talk about crime data, you have to understand that even the whole conversation is beginning with a very political choice about what we're even collecting data about. And even the crimes that are reported, like let's take rape, for example. Police are notoriously indifferent to sexual assault. Police are massive perpetrators of sexual assault. We've created a prison system where people are incredibly likely to be sexually assaulted inside prisons and jails. None of them are ever reported. So when police report crimes, they're not counting the crimes that are committed against people in jails and prisons. They're not counting the crimes that police commit, which are probably several million assaults every single year by even a conservative estimate. So, but take rape, for example. The vast majority of people who are sexually assaulted, according to surveys, don't bring that harm to police. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But I think it's the one thing we can say for sure is that most survivors of sexual assault choose not to bring that trauma and that harm into the criminal punishment system for a variety of reasons. The vast majority of these are incidents that take place between people who know each other intimately, people who have a familial relationship or intimate friendship. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons that it's not brought to police, but I guess the point is that if one were interested in figuring out how to have a society with less sexual violence, one would not start with the police. They don't even track most of those incidents. They don't solve the vast majority of the ones that are brought to them, and they don't convict but a small percentage of the people that are even brought to them, right? And so I think all of and yet when we're talking about sexual assault in our society, the main piece of data that's offered to us is police-reported rapes. And that is such a pathetic way for a society to have a conversation about toxic masculinity, to have a conversation about poverty, to have a conversation about the things that actually lead to most incidents of sexual assault. So anyway, I think I'm getting a little bit far afield from your initial question about data, but I want to talk more about crime data because it's so heavily manipulated and distorted. But I wanted to make like a overall point that like the things that we're even talking about are all politically chosen, and they're chosen for us because they want us having this very narrow conversation that constrains what we talk about as safety, and then has that conversation in scientific terms, while ignoring the sort of political choices that are being made about how narrow that conversation is.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is so important in terms of the ways in which science is also used as a tool for manipulation and control for certain types of narratives as well. What you're also talking about makes me want to ask, I think I know the answer to this question from your perspective, but I'm curious, a lot of what you are thinking, I think could lead a lot of people to say, oh, you know, what we need is reforms in order for the police to better handle sexual assault, or we need sexual assault legislation to say that it should be more heavily criminalized or it should be more heavily prosecuted. And I think, you know, as an abolitionist, I would say that that's not sort of the right answer, because inherently the systems of policing cannot be reformed. But I'm curious to what you would say to folks that would say like, well, if people aren't coming to the cops to report their rape, it's because we need to, you know, put more money into sensitivity training to cops in order for folks to feel more comfortable to approach them with their sexual assault cases. So I'm curious what your sort of response would be to that.
A lot of responses. First of all, it's sort of axiomatic that anytime there's a problem in our society, the police are going to say, we can solve that problem if you give us more money and more cops. I have never seen, and I have searched the literature and I've worked in this system for 15 years. I have never seen a shred of evidence that policing and prosecuting sexual assault leads to a society with less sexual assault. I think most of the sort of like data and evidence-based consensus is that sexual assault is a reflection of deep structural problems in our society that are not even operating at the same level as like police, prosecutors, and prisons. I don't think any prosecutor or police officer I've ever talked to thinks that when someone is deciding whether to sexually assault an intimate partner or deciding whether to sexually assault a child, they're weighing, is the penalty for this 17 years or is it 12 years? Is it 14 years or 9 years, right? That's not, and the perpetration of sexual assault is not a phenomenon that can be solved. It's not a phenomenon that can be solved thinking about individual choices. It's not like any type of crime, something that is to be solved by thinking there are bad people and good people, and bad people commit this crime and good people don't. And how do we punish the bad people for it? That's just, in my understanding of the literature and my own experience in life, that's just not how either the human mind or sort of more importantly, human social like systems work. That's just not what determines behavior. So there is not a single shred of evidence that more money for police would lead to a society with and in fact, there's a tremendous body of evidence to the contrary. There's a tremendous body of evidence that the aggression and violence and trauma and sexual assault that police commit, because keep in mind, police commit a huge amount of sexual assault. All throughout my career as a public defender, many of my clients were sexually assaulted by police in public through anal cavity searches and vaginal searches for drugs, through intentionally barbaric and torturous searches when they get processed into jails and prisons, through creating environments in jails and prisons where other people assault people as punishment. And so these systems are incredibly traumatic and violent themselves. They are leading to a culture that is producing and reproducing trauma like that. And moreover, the investments that have been made in police, like you all probably may have seen this, but over the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge scandal in police departments across the country because it emerged that they just were not testing rape kits. There were hundreds of thousands of rape kits that police departments had. They just were not testing them. They were choosing to use their scarce resources. Well, not that scarce. They were choosing to use their incredible resources to arrest people for drug possession and trespassing and driving on a suspended license, et cetera, disorderly conduct. Those are the main arrests in most cities. And choosing not to even bother to test the rape kits. And so I think massive investment in policing and its toxic masculine culture have actually led to a society that devalues the trauma and harm of sexual assault and doesn't understand its key drivers.
Yeah, and I think that dichotomy that you were naming of the systems of policing believing that there are good people and bad people just is categorically untrue. Like humans are so much more complex than just being quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. And I think it's really important for us to think about ways in which humans harm or hurt other humans, because that's just inherently going to happen, whether you think that you are quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. And the question really for me is, how do we then work towards understanding why harm or hurt was caused and what we can do to sort of move forward as a community and a group of people trying to be in community with each other. So I think that's really important. And, for folks that live in San Francisco, I think the scandal that you were speaking of rape kits not being tested in San Francisco, we saw also that folks who submitted rape kits, their DNA was then being used against police databases to, look up open warrants or unsolved cases. And so I think it's really important for folks who are, engaging with the criminal legal system. They're taking a massive risk in doing so. I mean, when you tie things together in terms of accountability and the systems of policing, it's just too complex to really be able to take accountability on its own. So I think that's really important. Thank you for that answer. Okay, let me see how much time we have. Okay, I want to maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about how all of these conversations and data and like constructions of so-called crime affect media narratives, which I know is something that you think and talk about a lot. I think in recent years, recent months, really, there's been an uptick of reports of quote unquote crime in the media. And some folks say that this is, a pushback against the events of 2020, the uprisings of 2020. And I'm curious sort of how you think the media narratives in recent months have changed and how that has then impacted policy decisions that folks have been making around police budgets or policing practices in general.
I think it's important just to say at the outset that we are living in a very reactionary time. I have never in my 15 years of studying these issues seen a media discourse and media culture that is so wildly divorced from evidence-based reality. It's important to understand, I think, both what I mean by that and how and why it's happened. So I'll start with the latter question. I think what we saw in the summer of 2020 was an unprecedented protest movement. And that protest movement developed some very key, very clear demands. You're a key part of this effort in San Francisco. So the demand to defund the police is very, very, very clear. The demand is to take resources that our society is currently investing in systems of pain and punishment, torture, that are ineffective for even their own stated goals, and to invest in the things that communities determine that they need to flourish, things like health and wellness and safe places to live, and art and music and theater programs for children, and any number of things that actually, when you ask, we talked last night on another panel, and you were saying, when you do your organizing, like when people say what their safe place is and what they think of as safety, they don't talk about cops and jails. They talk about these other things. So that was an incredible movement with millions of people out in the streets demanding. And I think for the first time in my professional career, the powerful people that control and profit from these bureaucracies of pain and punishment were very, very scared. They felt very threatened. And I think that the current media backlash is the result of an establishment, a corporate and a sort of carceral establishment that for the first time in a long, long time felt threats to its fundamental core structures and a threat to its own legitimacy, because people were starting to realize that this was an incredibly violent and wasteful and useless system. So that's, I think, why we've seen it starting to happen. I mean, it's important to note that, like, while it's worse now than it's ever been in my professional career, like it's not a new thing, right? I mean, we had Willie Horton, and we had the Central Park Five, and we had you had Hillary Clinton calling children super predators in the 90s. I mean, and even throughout the last 20 years, the media has not been calling for the abolition of these systems. The sort of the standard practice is to legitimate them. But there's something new now. What the San Francisco Chronicle is doing, what the Chicago Tribune is doing, what the New York Times is doing, what the Washington Post is doing, what all of the TV news stations are doing is, I think, profoundly dangerous to our survival. And I think in two ways. Number one, what they're doing is they are boosting this police narrative that I opened this discussion with. They are trying to get us to think very narrowly about what safety is. We are living in a time of incredibly, almost alarming, the alarming rise of authoritarianism, the right wing in this country, across the world. And there is a fundamental refusal of the media to recognize the threat of overt fascism. There is a looming ecological catastrophe, right? There is unprecedented numbers of evictions and unprecedented assault on basic freedoms like reproductive rights, like what teachers can tell students about in schools, right? There's all these issues that are profound threats to what a participatory society and what a ecologically sustainable world can look like. And the media is choosing to write article after article after article after article about shoplifting from CVS and Walgreens. And I think this is all part of an effort to get us to be very afraid, because when people are afraid, they're easily malleable. And the other thing that's going on is that people in power understand that we are about to face one of the most tumultuous times in human history in terms of the chaotic migration of hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And what we're seeing now, I think, is an attempt to build up the technological and surveillance and data systems and sort of penal infrastructure that is going to be necessary to manage this incredible sort of shock to global sort of conceptions of identity and to even in a more sort of visceral way, like an incredible shock to every local society that is going to have to deal with an incredible influx of migrants. I actually think it's all connected to this stuff. And I think what we're seeing them do is try to build that infrastructure of control. And then the second thing that they're doing is when they write these articles about a rise in crime, and I do a lot of talking about this publicly, so I'm only going to very crudely gesture at the point here, but they get us afraid about all these crimes. And then they make this huge leap that if you're afraid about these crimes, you should want more police. And they do this in a million different ways. One of them is that whenever there's some kind of a shooting, they just talk about it. They interview the cops. They have a photo of cops. They quote the cops saying what we need to do, as if cops are the main factor in whether there's lots of shootings or murders or not, and not things like inequality, poverty, housing, the incredible availability of guns in our society. So this media narrative is designed to both scare us about all the wrong things, and to indoctrinate us with this idea that if we're afraid about those things, we need punishment as the solution to them.
Yeah, and I think there's oftentimes also in media this assumption that correlation equals causation as well. Like more cops means less crime, or more cops means more public safety, as you were saying. And I think that they only use the one variable of policing as a way to prove whatever outcome they want. And it's always more policing and more cops, whether that's crime has gone up, then more cops are needed, or crime has gone down, then more cops are needed. And both those things can't be true at the same time. So I guess I'm curious, sort of like, what are ways that you think we can have a much more nuanced conversation about the systems and structures that lead to harm in the first place? And possibly like what sort of data or narratives could be crafted in order to have a more accurate conversation about policing and so-called crime?
I think we urgently need a global coalition of scientists to work to develop a standard index for what it means to be safe. And this needs to be done in a liberatory, participatory process with the people who are most at risk in a variety of different types of societies. We can start by just doing it here in this country too, I mean, but I think what we need is some conception of what are the basic building blocks of a safe, flourishing life. There are some scientists and public health scholars and philosophers that have sort of tried to do this over the years. What's been missing is really the implementation of that project. What's been missing are a few things. Really, genuine, real participation from the most vulnerable people, but also like an idea for how do you actually bureaucratically like implement that? How do we get to the point where when the board of supervisors in San Francisco is trying to decide what to do, they're not looking at like police data to determine what safety means. They're looking at a wide range of indicators that include things like, do people have safe places to live? Is the water that they're drinking and the food that they're eating killing them? Do they have access to play? Like, do they have time and ability and space to just frolic and play and do the things that humans are meant to do? We need a much broader conception of what safety means, and we need some way of quantifying it and implementing, implementing it as the primary lens through which the media talks about safety and through which policymakers think about safety. And I think that is a very urgent thing that scientists from a variety of disciplines need to come together to try to create, so that when we talk about when we have these conversations, we're talking about all harm, all forms of harm, and not just that narrow range of harms that get reported to police, and that even narrower range of harms that police can even pretend to do anything about, and that even narrower range of harms that police ever even do anything about.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess my last question before we go to audience questions is building off of what you were just saying, and thinking about once we have that, I guess, more nuanced conversation about what is actually keeping people safe. I'm curious sort of like how you think that then would lead into better policymaking decisions that are driven by that data as opposed to quote unquote crime data.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that I don't want to say data is largely irrelevant, because I don't think that. But I do think that many of the problems in our society aren't because we don't have the data. It's not like we don't have the data that would let us know whether universal healthcare would be good for people in this country. It's not like we don't have the data about many of the key issues in our world. The problem is one of power, really. So when I suggested the participatory process a moment ago about a new conceptualization of what it means to be safe, I was less thinking about it in terms of like, oh, if we just like went to the San Francisco mayor and said, did you know that the war on drugs was a failure? And that like the way to prevent people from overdosing on fentanyl in San Francisco is actually not to cage users of fentanyl. And she would say, oh my goodness, you're right. I had never seen this evidence. My emergency plan to flood the Tenderloin district with more cops just seems like such folly right now. You know, that's just not how policymakers are making decisions at all. But what I more meant was like, if you created a participatory process and you had this incredible coalition of people across realm of medical sciences and public health and teachers and the arts and you know, labor and young people and old people and communities of color and indigenous communities, and if you brought together an incredible array of people and you worked on a process like this that was genuinely participatory, part of what you're doing is deconstructing a lot of the propaganda that we've all been inculcated with about what safety means, and you're changing people's fundamental attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions in a way that I think is more akin to like political education. It's like a participatory political education process about, hey, what does it mean to be safe? And then it's a political act, I think, to like articulate that and to start making a set of demands about, well, we demand that there shall be no evictions. And part of what safety means for us is that landlords may not evict us. And part of what safety means for us in our community is like, there will not be any polluted water. And so like these things, you could imagine like these things becoming constitutional rights in some political sense through a mass movement that attempts to articulate them more clearly. So I don't think it's a matter of just like showing the data to policymakers. And I think that's one area where academics and philanthropists just they're putting so much money into like doing more studies and then like having a blue ribbon commission that like produces a report and then gives the data. What they're missing is how actual social movements work, how power works. You actually need not just the right answer as a matter of like some kind of like objective truth of like what the best policy is. You need a political plan for how you're going to actually have enough power to implement it.
Yeah, I think that's really, really powerful. And I think one of the things that, you know, we've seen in having conversations between neighbors is how in talking about public safety and in deconstructing what policing means and what public safety means to individuals, you also see individuals have this sort of like internal transformation within themselves about, you know, the cops that all live within all of us, and trying to think about, you know, what do I actually want in my life in order to feel fulfilled, in order to feel safe, and how does that differ from what, you know, society or what the media tells me I should need or should want. And I think those conversations are really powerful for that internal transformation and internal healing. And I think when those conversations are had, it's also a way to reduce harms within that community just by talking about what other people's like definitions of safety mean, because oftentimes we don't know what our neighbors or what our friends or what our loved ones would actually consider safe. We just sort of assume it's what the media tells us safety looks like. So I think those conversations are extremely, extremely powerful. And in building that coalition, you're building, you know, communal power. And when communal power is built, it's also not centralized in terms of one person having all that power. And so it's much easier, I think, to also make those collective decisions that are for the good of the community as opposed to the good of one person. Okay, I think that we are at time for questions from me. So I will now turn it over to folks in the audience if they have any questions. I think maybe we have people go to that mic. How do you turn it on?
Hello. Okay. Anybody who has questions can come up here to ask them. Feel free.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for that conversation. It was really interesting. My question here is, I saw it reported yesterday in the media that like 65% of Bay Area residents were like uncomfortable going to major downtowns because of crime issues, right? Which is like something that someone who lives in a Bay Area downtown would never say, right? And so part of my question here is, you're talking about like conversations between neighbors and like having this, and how do you build that sort of like empathy and understanding and even this connection to going beyond the media data when so much of power, and we know like so much electoral power, all of this is concentrated in suburban, rural communities, white communities that maybe like these people don't come into the city of San Francisco. These people would never go into the city of Oakland. And like, how do you like sort of build this like community movement and like connect to these people in other communities and build that sort of involvement and I guess buy-in in those communities to get around this sort of media issue, right? Like how do you break the 6 o'clock news stranglehold or monopoly, I guess, on that information?
Sure, I can start, and I'll give you anything to add. I think the questions really start with the individual. I think it's really important to have questions and conversations about where an individual is coming from and what that individual needs. I think, you know, when we ask a question around like, do you think that the police budget is the right amount? Folks might say yes, or folks might say no based on the media narratives, for example. But if we ask the question of what does public safety look like to you, that open-ended question around what are you actually looking for yourself and for your community, it's much easier, I think, for people to imagine the world that they want to see. And oftentimes that's one that does not have increased policing. So I think that's one piece in terms of having really grounded conversations in what people need right then, and giving people really actionable steps. So for example, we oftentimes hear people saying, you know, I don't feel comfortable walking from the BART station to my house because I always see an unhoused neighbor. And so the question then is like, okay, do you want someone to talk to that unhoused neighbor? Have you ever approached that unhoused neighbor and talked to them and seen, or asked them what their name is, or asked them how they're doing? We oftentimes give people really actionable like pamphlets that say how to talk to your unhoused neighbor, or alternative numbers to call instead of calling the cops, for example. So I think that's one piece. And I think the other piece is really over time, deconstructing a lot of the narratives that are in the media. These conversations, I think, cannot happen just once. They're really ongoing conversations that need to happen over time. And once you sort of build trust with people, you can say, oh, look at this great graph that I found that actually shows the way that the San Francisco city budget is broken down. And here's how much money goes into the police. Is this something that you agree with? Do you feel like we should redistribute the money in certain ways? And I think having that sense of political education that is really accurate and grounded in what's actually happening on the ground can also be really powerful for folks to say, oh, I didn't actually know. These are not the things that media is telling me. And so I think those two things together, sort of like deconstructing, I think what Alex said, deconstructing what quote unquote crime is for individuals and what public safety actually means, while also sort of encouraging a more nuanced conversation around political education that's broader than just what the media is sharing, can be really powerful in starting to build coalition and starting to fight against the propaganda that's in the media today. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I think this is such a hard question. I wish I knew the answer, because I really believe that we are at a the word crisis does not even begin to capture where I think our civilization finds itself. And yet we're all living fairly normal lives in some respects. Like what's chilling to me is if you go back and you read like accounts of people as their society descended into more and more overt fascism over history, what you find are people writing about the most mundane things. They write about a party they went to, or a bar they went to with friends, or a musical performance, and it's like, when it's happening to you, it's hard to sort of appreciate the scope of what we're about to see happening. Whether it's what's happening in India right now, or Hungary, or Poland, Brazil, here, there is a wave of authoritarian violence coming, especially with the global migration crisis that's about to happen, that I don't think it's unlike anything any of us have ever seen. And the authoritarian bureaucracies that are going to be controlling it will now have access to unprecedented level of technological and military resources that is unlike anything that we've ever confronted as a civilization. So like for me, I try, as you can probably tell, in every interaction I have with people, to impress upon them the importance of getting involved in social movements. It's not enough to just have certain views. You have to be out there organizing with people, building mutual aid networks, like engaging those people in conversation and then organizing them. Our only hope is if we do that at an urgent pace. And different people are going to have different skills and abilities. You know, if you're in a community of environmental scientists, you know, it might be very clear what you guys should be organizing around. If you and your neighbors are in a particular fight around policing, it might be very clear. But sometimes it's not so clear. It's like you have a wide range of skills and interests in different communities you're a part of, and you have to make hard decisions about who you're going to organize and how, and you have to be doing it. And like I don't know what more to say other than that, like, we have to be trying to reach out to those people and impress upon them the urgency of the situation, politically educating them with all the skills and tools and resources that we can muster, and then trying to orient that new community toward actual political fights that are going to change the balance of power. If we don't do that urgently and quickly in all of these realms, in the academic realm, in the research community, in neighborhoods, in workplaces, then I'm very scared about what's coming.
Thank you so much for that response. I have a question from Zoom. Kartika is asking, are there other countries or communities around the world that have created inclusive safety infrastructures? And if so, what are some of the lessons we can learn from them, and how can we implement them in our society?
Do we go?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, if you study the history of the world, you will see that many, and I think it's fair to say most, previous and other current societies have found many different ways of approaching the concept of public safety that don't involve mass human caging. So we are caging people at rates that are unprecedented in the recorded history of the modern world. So even without like a whole lot of imagination, you could just say, well, why don't we start by like having the US cage people at the same rate as England or Canada? If you want to stay in like two very, very predominantly wealthy white Western countries. Then you could even branch out further and say, well, why don't we cage people at the same rate that the United States did in 1975? Let's just start by, and that would be a reduction of 80% of this punishment bureaucracy. And if you did that, I think you would then see that most of what's happening with it is just like, once this bureaucracy kind of gets it grows, the more it grows, the more politically powerful it becomes, the more it's able to control narrative and to control assumptions, attitudes, and beliefs, and to control expenditures. And so like a lot of it is not, it doesn't require a whole lot of imagination to just like return us to what we were doing 50 years ago or 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, or to have us do in this country what most other countries do, which is to solve most of the social issues, or to at least work on them, that we currently handle in the criminal punishment system through other systems. Then if you want to get even more radical, there are incredible, beautiful, amazing examples, both in local communities in this country and in societies across the world, of people solving their own problems without the need for. One of my favorite books on this is called Anarchy Works, which is just a great book by Peter Gelderloos, and it's just a whole book of examples of people solving these problems without resorting to state violence. And in my own work, just to give you one example from here in the Bay Area, there's a group called Silicon Valley Debug, which has this thing called participatory defense, and they organize families whose loved ones are going through the criminal system. So if your loved one's arrested and put in jail and in court, the family can go to this place where they meet other families whose loved ones are going through that same process. They learn basic questions. People are scared. It's like, what does it even mean to have an arraignment? What is a pretrial hearing? What happens at sentencing? You learn basic questions, but you also get a lot of political information, and you start to learn about like how and why these decisions are being made. And like, you learn things like, in our society in the US right now, we decide who's in a cage and who's free with their family based on how much money they have. That's like, literally, can you pay cash bail? 400,000 people are in jail right now as we're sitting here talking in this country because they don't have enough money for cash. Once people start learning that, it's radicalizing. Then they meet other families, right? And they start organizing together, and they start in this political process. And so the next stage of that is, eventually when someone is arrested and brought into court and there's a lawyer standing there, the lawyer can say, "Judge, don't put my client in jail before trial. Don't put an electronic monitoring device on them that excludes where they can go and that monitors all of their movements. We have an entire network of families here. These families will hold this person. They will make sure the person comes back to court. They will make sure the person gets the help they need pending trial. They will make sure that the person makes all of their treatment appointments, et cetera." And what we've now done there is we've created a community-based alternative to a system of probation, supervision, and policing and jailing that is actually, not only is it like beautiful and inspiring, and when you're involved in a project like that, like it's exhilarating, and it makes you want to connect with people even more, and it sort of grows, right? But it's also like, it's not carceral. It's about building bonds rather than breaking bonds. It's about community versus isolation, and it's about it's not about whether individuals are bad and whether bad people need to be punished. It's about how do we as a community create the conditions under which people do good things. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of different examples, and I encourage you to read some of the literature out there on how communities all across the world and throughout history have dealt with safety that in ways that don't involve armed government bureaucrats and massive caging facilities.
And I think the one thing that I will add is also thinking about how the folks who are oftentimes the most well-resourced are not the ones that have cops in their neighborhoods as well. When we think about, I think one of the things that Alec mentioned earlier in terms of the ways in which laws are enforced, we oftentimes don't see, young white college students going to jail for drugs, for example. And that's because they have the resources in place in order to have alternatives to the criminal legal system. And when we think about offering folks the ability to have the resources in order to solve problems within their own community, it's just another way for folks to basically not participate in the criminal legal system and show that there is an alternative, and the alternative is oftentimes just more resources and building of community, like Alec just mentioned.
If there are any more in-person questions, please feel free to come up, but I do have one more question from a Zoom attendee. So they ask, how do neighborhood watches in suburban communities begin to develop in the United States, and how do these contribute to the validation of the power of police, the validation of the power that police hold in these communities, and what are some steps forward to mitigate or not use these kinds of systems?
I personally don't know a whole lot about the history of particular neighborhood watch efforts, but I will say this is a really tricky thing. So there are ways of doing like a neighborhood watch where a community itself says, we are going to handle our own safety, and we are going to not involve the state punishment bureaucracy in that effort at all. We're going to handle our own safety through a tight-knit set of community relationships that look out for each other. And there's many examples throughout history of this kind of thing happening. It was one of the cornerstones of a lot of Black Panther organizing, for example. That's really different from a system of like vigilante justice that, is organized in order to be a supplement to police violence. So like, I don't know which of those two poles the question was really getting at, but like, one thing police have done is they've tried to create a culture of fear so that individuals report on each other, and police delegate a lot of their authority to like roving bands of like right-wing vigilantes. It's sort of like, and then you get things like what happened to Trayvon Martin. And I think the difference is one of them is based in community and solidarity and a notion that we do not need state violence to keep us safe. The other is based in a culture of fear and isolation and pitting every person against each other. And that is a really, really different, those are two really different models of what a neighborhood could do. And I think it's imperative that we help neighborhoods create their own system of non-police, non-state bureaucratic, non-violent like methods of community response to harm and community prevention of harm.
Yeah, I think also oftentimes some types of neighborhood watch, they also centralize power in the same way that policing centralizes power. And I think when you centralize power, you inherently get a system of policing and revenge because certain people have the power to control or to manipulate others. And I think the other thing is that in order for a neighborhood watch or community solidarity project to be successful, there needs to be that sense of community in the first place. To have a neighborhood watch in a place where folks don't know their neighbors, it's really difficult, because who are you actually watching out for? And what is the definition of public safety that you're using together to define for yourself what the community looks like when it is or isn't safe? And I think a part of that is really deconstructing for yourself and doing the individual work of understanding, what does public safety look like to me? What are ways that I have harmed or hurt other people? What are ways that I would want folks to help me in that healing process? What does accountability look like for me if I have been harmed? All those sorts of questions to understand, what does safety mean to me, and how can I deconstruct what we were talking about earlier, the sort of dichotomy between quote unquote good and quote unquote bad. And I think a lot of times neighborhood watches don't do that internal and community work. And so they just perpetuate the biases within the community. And oftentimes those biases, as we've sort of been talking about, are reinforced by media narratives and sensationalization of crime. So I think that it's really, really important that before folks undergo an effort of community organization and of community solidarity to really do that hard work, both internally and between members of that community, to deconstruct and define for themselves what would make them safe and what they want and need.
Kind of continuing on this topic of community safety and like holding, I guess, people who are in the criminal justice process and community, what is the role that people are or like could play in community safety who are people who have previously like caused harm? Yeah.
Sure, I can start with this. I think that's a really good question. I think that, you know, a lot of times when we look at transformative justice or restorative justice processes, it's really important for both the person who has been harmed and the person who has done the harm to be in a sense of community. We never want to sort of leave people out, and we never want folks to feel like they are being attacked or are being separated from their loved ones, which is inherently what policing and revenge and caging does to individuals. They separate them and control them. And I think in order to break that cycle and in order to break that mindset, we need to surround folks with community and with love. And I think that is both on the side of the folks that have been harmed and for the harm doers. And I think that folks who have done harm to other people, they need to sort of, if they have the resources and time and capacity, be able to undergo a healing process within themselves. Because oftentimes, you know, people don't wake up one day and decide to hurt or harm a loved one or hurt or harm someone that they know. It comes from a place or of a reaction from their past experiences. So being able to really understand and heal from past experiences is important for folks who have undergone harm, and for people who have maybe had like experiences to come together in community to do that work themselves and together. And I think that's really important for thinking about in this accountability process, the ways in which we are supporting all types of individuals and treating both folks who have experienced harm and who have harmed other folks with a level of, you know, we are not going to leave you. We are going to support you. We are going to be there for you in your healing journey in whatever way that we can. And for folks to step up and decide to take accountability in those processes as well.
That was really, that was great. I don't have a lot to add. I would just say that there's a really great free short movie called The Feminist on Cell Block Y, which features a friend of mine named Richie. You can watch it at CNN.com. It's a movie about years of organizing that Richie did in the California prisons, and a program he developed for people in prison to go through a transformative justice program about sort of toxic masculinity. And it's really beautiful and really amazing, and like I think hits at a lot of the themes that underlie your question. And I would also just add that like Aditi said earlier, like we all cause harm, all have caused harm in different ways. And like different types of harm and trauma require different responses, and not everyone is going to want to or be able to participate in every kind of healing process, but we have to figure out a way of, when harm is done, of rebuilding the kind of social bonds that were broken there in some way. And I think one thing that makes that movie so beautiful is it leaves you with a sense of real hope about the simple power of organizing can do to, and if you have a society that is healthy, that where people are organized in a variety of different ways and have a lot of different kinds of bonds with different kinds of people that are kind of overlapping and intersecting. If you have a society like that, and I think there's a reason that the neoliberal capitalist order has tried to break a lot of those bonds over the last 50 years. Like they want us isolated in individual family atomized units with our own little houses and yards and cars. There's a reason for all that. They don't want people organizing with their coworkers. The more overlapping sets of bonds that we create, the easier it is to respond when someone harms someone in trauma, because there's more different shared axes of experience, and there's more communities that are overlapping that can help the harmed and person and the person who harmed them discover like a shared space on which to build. So we have a society that is like really, really unorganized. Many of us don't have a lot of like communities that we're a part of that are in real solidarity. And I believe that's intentional. I believe it has to do with how our public spaces are designed. I believe it has to do with things like debt and poverty and inequality and things that are designed to make people not have the time and space and energy to like form bonds with other people. And so, those are things that came to my mind with your question. Not an answer really, but just things that came to mind.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But if everybody could give a big round of applause to Aditi and Alec for joining us today. It was truly an honor to have you both. I personally admire both of your work. And if you all have questions that you want to ask one-on-one, we will have a happy hour at the end of today where Aditi and Alec will both be. So feel free to have those conversations. The second, I wanted to plug two more things. The second is that right after this, we have workshops. So you'll be heading to one of the smaller rooms. So please check your Shed app if you haven't already. And the final thing is I just wanted to mention for the person who asked that question on Zoom is that there is a community called the Zapatistas who have controlled Chiapas, Mexico for almost 30 years now. They have abolished prisons as we know it. And if that's a point that you'd like to Google, I know people want to see sort of case studies. That is somewhere you can look, but I also want to echo what Aditi and Alec said about whose imagination are we living in and how do we expand beyond that. And on that note, one more round of applause and thank you so much.